Hello there, friends. I'm Mark Thomas, and I'm the minister at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Blackwood. Thanks so much for joining me and taking this opportunity to study a book of the Bible. And we are currently studying the book of Nehemiah, and this is session 2. So, a lively book in the Old Testament. So, I hope you've got your Bible to hand. Open it to Nehemiah, and we'll crack on. What can we say about the book of Nehemiah? Well, Nehemiah is a lively piece of writing. It's a combination of autobiography and biography, a personal record punctuated with asides and frank comments. It's the memoirs of somebody, or at least the first half of the book is. And it covers the multi-dimensional, multifaceted aspect of what renewal means. Renewal for a country, for a city, for a people, and a lot of different aspects of what renewal is about come out of the book of Nehemiah. Have you ever heard the phrase or contemplated yourself the thought, I don't know how to pray? Well, of course, the Lord Jesus Christ, he gave us, in a sense, what we now call the Lord's Prayer, and started off by saying, when you pray, say, Our Father, who is in heaven. You may know the rest of it. Well, so Jesus gave us, in a sense, a perfect model for prayer. Nehemiah gives us a really helpful model for prayer too. And we saw that last week, really, in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah learns about a situation and then prays about that situation. He learns and laments, he receives a report, he repents in prayer and makes a request to the King of Heaven. Well, let's crack on with our study for today. I'm going to share my screen briefly to give us a reminder of the overview of this book. We won't be doing this every week, but it might help us to refresh our memory of this book that contains 13 chapters. And we're looking to build back better as we study the book of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah has 13 chapters. How do you understand that as a one big chunk? Well, the best thing to do is to split it in half. The first 7 chapters, autobiography. The remaining chapters, biography. Somebody else, in a sense, speaking about Nehemiah. I said there were 13 chapters. What's happened to the 13th one, you might be wondering? Well, it's tagged on at the end. It's characteristically different to chapters 8 to 12. So there's a block, if you like, of how it can possibly be understood. One alternative is to divide it up like this. And so you've got chapters 1 to 6, or 1 to 7, probably I would change it to, 8 to 10, 11 to 12, and 13. Not equal sizes, but 4 chunks. You know, sometimes it's easier to deal in smaller chunks than to try and cope with the whole mass. And we're looking at the first section at the moment, the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. That's very much dominates the first 7 chapters. So chapter 1, last week, you might remember, we saw in chapter 1, and you can see it in your Bible, the first 3 verses stand out as the appeal made to Nehemiah by brothers who had traveled from Jerusalem to explain the situation. And they appeal to Nehemiah. And then in verses 4 to 11, which contain Nehemiah's prayer, we have Nehemiah's response. Another way of structuring this is to see that Nehemiah learns about the wall and then laments over the wall. Or alternatively, if you like a different outline, the plight of Jerusalem and then the prayer of Nehemiah. So let me stop sharing my screen for a moment. We'll come back to that in a second or two. Within Nehemiah's response in verses 4 to 11 of that first chapter, we have Nehemiah's prayer. And we spent a little bit of time studying that last week, so we don't need to go through all that again. But I thought I would just remind you of what we discovered, which was that verses 4 to 7, Nehemiah talks of Israel's plight, the difficulty that they had experienced, the trauma that they had gone through as a result of their disobedience towards God. God's people had disobeyed his laws and were, in a sense, suffering the consequences and the penalty for that. God had judged them. And yet, God is not just a judge, God is gracious. And it's not long before Nehemiah, in verses 8 to 10, remind God of his promises to his people. And he quotes from Leviticus and Deuteronomy further back in the Old Testament, which basically say that if the people repent, the Lord has promised to restore them. And Nehemiah reminds God of his gracious, generous, wonderful promises. Before, in verse 11, he talks about, he makes his request in prayer, his specific prayer request, which is an interesting structure, isn't it? You know, so often we start with what we want from God. You know, our prayers are, Lord, give me this, or Lord, do that. Whereas Nehemiah works through their state, their situation, and is humble before God, recognizing their faults and their failings and their sins, before recognizing that that's not the place to remain. The place to go to after that is to see the wonder of God's goodness, the offer of forgiveness through God's promises. Before then, after all that, and that's the foundation on which you can then go to God in prayer and ask him for things. So it's a helpful structure. I can remember when I was in college a few years back, we used to have a preaching class called sermon class, and sometimes the feedback from tutors could leave you as a withering wreck at the back of the classroom after you'd done your best to deliver a sermon. And I can remember one of the sermons. I say remember, I actually came across an old notebook in the study here from that class, and it contains a whole series of sermons that various students that I was in college with had preached. And there was one sermon on this Nehemiah chapter 1 and a prayer. And let me show you the outline of the sermon. It went like this. The preacher had said, "We've messed up, but you are great, so will you help?" And I look at that outline now, and I sort of smile. And some of the notes that I wrote in my study book at the time, the feedback from the tutors was this: it lacked creative finesse. It wasn't memorable, and it wasn't unique. It could apply to anything. I told you the feedback could be quite brutal sometimes. And yet I also noted that one of the tutors gave the feedback: despite all that, this is a great sermon because it's true and it's helpful. And I like that. So I don't know whether the student, the preacher of the day, was encouraged by that, or they were still the quivering wreck at the back of the classroom. But there's a summary of Nehemiah's prayer in that first chapter. We've messed up, God, but you are great, God. So will you help, God? I like it anyway. So let's move on to the study proper for today, really, and get into Nehemiah chapter 2. And we see that following the report, let me go back, sorry, following the report of the situation in chapter 1, we now get Nehemiah's request to the king before we get to review, he gets to review the situation. So let me just stop sharing my screen again, because sometimes that can be a bit distracting. At this point, I'd really like to encourage you to just open your Bible to Nehemiah chapter 2 and read the first 10 verses. I won't read them to you, and I'll encourage you just to pause the video at this point, okay, and read the first 10 verses at your own pace, at yourself, and see if you can get a feel for what's being said there here, what's being said there. Whilst you do that, and whilst you pause the video here, I'm going to put a little video that you can watch once you've finished your reading, and it's a little video from the wonderful organization called the Bible Society, and it's just one of their presenters called Andrew Ollerton, and he is in Jerusalem, and he's talking a little bit about the walls. It's just a couple of minutes, so enjoy this video, and it'll give you a feel for us diving into the passage in a moment or two.
Outside the old city walls of Jerusalem here, very important site, because when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, they sacked the city, destroyed the walls, brought them down to a pile of rubble, destroyed the temple, and led away all the able-bodied people into what's known as exile. They were force-marched all the way around down to Babylon, far from home. There they sat down by the rivers of Babylon. You may have heard that song from a psalm that speaks about them weeping as they remembered Zion, the city of Jerusalem, now destroyed. Well, fast forward a few decades, and Nehemiah, one of the Israelites, one of the Hebrews, has been given a prominent position of power in Babylon. He hears that these walls are destroyed and he begins to weep. It says in the book of Nehemiah, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept, and I fasted and prayed. And he asked God to help restore the walls. And God basically said, why don't you be the answer to that prayer? To cut a long story short, Nehemiah says, the gracious hand of my God was upon me. He got incredible favor and resources, returned to Jerusalem and built up these walls. Many of these walls here, you can see, were built in the time of Nehemiah and then later periods of restoration as well. Behind me here, you can just see the dung gate. One of the families said, we'll fix the dung gate. What heroes when you prepare to fix the dung gate. Everyone mucked in and together they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Most builders struggled to finish on time. Nehemiah and the builders of the wall had such favor, they finished in rapid time. And then along with Ezra, they worked to call God's people who'd been in exile back to the Torah. They celebrated the Passover. They recovered faithfulness to Yahweh here in the city of Jerusalem. Post-exile then, the walls were rebuilt, the temple was rebuilt, the nation was rebuilt, and they began to wait then for the promise of the Messiah who would come and bring ultimate restoration and hope. Nehemiah and the city of Jerusalem.
There you go. So there's the Bible Society with their series of videos called Bible Trek. If you go onto their Bible Society website or Bible Society YouTube channel, you'll find a whole series of those, just 2-minute snippets on various aspects of history and archaeology and theology throughout the Bible. So check those out or go and watch that video again. Anyway, let's dive into our study of Nehemiah now. And make sure you've got chapter 2 open in front of you, because what we have in chapter 2 is the request that Nehemiah makes of the king. Okay, get that word in your head, request. It follows on from the report that he received in chapter 1. So chapter 1 is about the report, the sad news from Jerusalem. Then chapter 2 is about the request that he made. In particular, verses 1 to 5, we might label as the petition to the king. This is interesting, isn't it? Nehemiah makes a petition to the king, King Artaxerxes, after he's made a petition to the King of Heaven, the prayer in chapter 1. Nehemiah asks King Artaxerxes for a leave of absence, if you like, so that he might return and assist with help and enable the rebuilding of the walls in Jerusalem. Here's a question for you. After the prayer in chapter 1, how long does he have to wait before he can make this request to the king? If I said to you it was a week, would it feel like a long time that you had to pray for a week and wait for a week? If I said a month, would that feel like a long time? Praying and fasting and waiting for your opportunity? What if I told you it was 4 months? 4 months is how long he had to wait. And we know that because, well, what's the first thing it says in chapter 2? In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, the month of Nisan. Okay, so you don't know what that is. I know it's difficult when you don't understand the ancient calendar. It'll be a little bit like us saying to an alien that comes from Mars, it's April. And they're going to go, so April, what does that mean? Well, what's the month of Nisan mean? Well, the month of Nisan probably was about April. What we do know is that it's 4 months since the month of Chislev, which you see in chapter 1, verse 1. So we do know that there's 4 months gap between, in a sense, chapter 1 and chapter 2, between Nehemiah's prayer and Nehemiah's opportunity to make a request to the king. Sometimes we need to be both patient and persistent in our prayers, even if it takes 4 months before we're able to work through the prayer, the answer to the prayer. And I guess that Nehemiah was normally fairly cheerful in his duties. Perhaps it was royal etiquette not to reveal how you felt. It actually might have been a condition of the job. Otherwise, the king might have got suspicious that you were very happy and that you were perhaps plotting something during a period of time where absolutely nobody trusted absolutely everybody. Then to see somebody looking sad or downcast might have caused suspicion, and it might have ended up resulting in a bad state of affairs for Nehemiah. Maybe he would have been sent off to the dungeons or sent out to be disposed of if the king got any whiff of the sense that Nehemiah was trying to plot against him. Anyway, clearly Nehemiah is not cheerful on this particular occasion, on this particular day, on this particular encounter with the king. And it's because of his concern about the situation in Jerusalem. And the king noticed that he was sad. Nehemiah explains that this was because Jerusalem, although the word Jerusalem is not mentioned in the text anywhere here, we know that's what he's talking about. It's where his ancestors came from, it's where they lived and where they died, and it had recently been ravaged, and Nehemiah, having heard about this, is sad. And yet what I find interesting here is that he shows such wisdom in making this just a personal matter, not a political matter. He addresses the king and simply explains that there's something that's troubling him. He doesn't try and make it a political issue to do with the relationship between nations and regions. And that would have been much more difficult for the king to respond to. But when it's just one person with one burning desire, one longing deep in their heart, then, well, here we see the king shows a measure of compassion, or at least a positive response. And in verses 4 and 5, we see that it says, the king said to me, what is it you want? And then I prayed to the God in heaven. And what did he pray? I don't know. You can read it as much as I can. I have no idea what he prayed. But I guess it was perhaps one of those, what would we call them? Arrow prayers. One of those, Lord, help me just now, in this immediate situation. Granted, he'd had 4 months to prepare for it, but nevertheless, he still wanted God's help here and now in response to this question. And there's a sense in which we wait with bated breath as Nehemiah gasps a prayer and braces himself for the response, for the reply. Artaxerxes asks him if there's anything that he wished to take with him. And there's almost a view that the king is sympathetic and supportive of Nehemiah's hopes. So Nehemiah expresses his desire to go to Jerusalem and to aid with repairing the situation there. He'd given careful thought as to what was required. And that's important to realize, because things are often more complicated than they first appear, aren't they? Ask anyone that's trying to decorate a small bedroom, as is happening just along the corridor from this room. Ask anyone who's trying to organize a 90th birthday celebration for their mother, or in my case, mother-in-law. Things are often more complicated than we imagine. Ask anyone trying to hold an in-person, face-to-face church service at the moment. It's actually quite complicated. more complicated than it first appears. So here we acknowledge that Nehemiah carefully plans the situation. And having made the petition to the king in verses 1 to 5, we now see the permission granted from the king in verses 6 to 10. So following the petition to the king, we get the permission from the king. This is the answer to prayer in verses 6 to 10. Artaxerxes not only permits Nehemiah to go, but he also agrees to help finance the project, which is an answer to prayer beyond what I imagine Nehemiah could have possibly hoped and longed and dreamt for. God moved in the heart and mind of the king to give Nehemiah every conceivable help in his undertaking. So Nehemiah travels to Jerusalem. Despite the protest of a couple of non-Jews called Sanballat and Tobiah, we're going to come up against them in a moment or two again. And Nehemiah also asks for and gets letters of permission, of support, of instruction. Do you see them there down in verses 7 onwards? He also, in verse 9, gets the accompaniment of an army officers and the cavalry. This, I guess, is to ensure that he doesn't get ambushed or kidnapped and safely arrives in Jerusalem. It's also suggested by Derek Kidner, the Old Testament scholar, that this would mean, of course, that Nehemiah, once he arrived in Jerusalem, would arrive in style. He would appear not just as an individual or just with a few other people, but the cavalry would be with him. It was also something that perhaps would have reassured the people upon his arrival, because he had been appointed governor of Jerusalem. We find that later on in this book in chapter 5. And as governor of Jerusalem, he comes with a message to say that the king of Persia, King Artaxerxes, has actually changed his mind. Yep, the king had previously told the people not to build, to stop building indeed. Whereas now Nehemiah comes in the message and says, basically, well, the king has allowed us and indeed encouraged us to rebuild. Well, the people might have needed some reassurance that this wasn't just fake news and that it was genuinely true and that they wouldn't get into trouble if they did start rebuilding. So the arrival in style with army officers and the cavalry would have contributed to reassuring the people that this was a genuine message with full authority from the king. The letters, we see that there's a letter to Asaph. In verse 8, he was keeper of the royal parks, it says. Those royal parks were typically understood to be about 6 miles south of Jerusalem, and they would have been the source of the timber and the wood that Nehemiah and his colleagues would have needed in the rebuilding. And it also says that the king asked, how long will you be away? What time will you be back? He's seeking a specific period of time here, but the answer is not stated as to what it is. You'll have to read on to find out how long Nehemiah was away. In fact, if you want some homework, then go and see if you can find out how long it was before Nehemiah returned back to Jerusalem. By the way, I'll give you a little hint. It's not as soon as you think. Anyway, in this section here, as he gets permission from the king, we also have the wonderful testimony, his personal testimony there in verse 8 as to how Nehemiah understands what's just happened. He says, the gracious hand of my God was on me. I wonder if you could say that. Can you say that about a situation that's happened in the last week or two? The gracious hand of my God was on me. This isn't Nehemiah patting himself on the back and saying, oh, look what I was able to persuade the king to do. Look what I was able to get out of the king. I've obviously got great skill and great ability and diplomatic understandings of the situation. I know how to play the king. There's absolutely none of that here. This is simply a humble man acknowledging that it is God who has been behind this situation. The gracious hand of my God was on me. There it is in verse 8. So, verse 9, Nehemiah set out on the long journey from Susa to Jerusalem, and when he arrived in the region north of Judea called Trans-Euphrates, says in my translation, we also know that to be a place called Samaria, he encountered these two characters, Sanballat and Tobiah. Do you see them in verse 10? Do you remember when Jesus encountered Samaritans and had dealings with Samaritans? He met them at the well. He used them as illustrations in his stories and parables. Sometimes they were opponents of his, not always. Well, Sanballat was the governor of Samaria, according to ancient documents. But what I found really interesting, if you dig into the background of Sanballat, it's not here in the text, but he had two sons, Delaiah and Shelemiah. No, not names that trip off your tongue, I grant you that. But the way in which those names are spoken and indeed written, they end with the words, the same letters that we see in Isaiah and Jeremiah. Isaiah, somebody who worshipped Yahweh, God. Jeremiah, somebody who worshipped Yahweh, God. Well, it was those who worshipped Yahweh, God, that used names that had this ending on it, Delaiah, Shelemiah, which suggests that Sanballat was somebody who worshipped Yahweh, God. Why am I making a point of this? Well, only just to say that even though they are clearly opponents of Nehemiah in this story, and they are resisting what Nehemiah believes God has called them to do, they are not actually opponents of God. The thing that I want to reflect on in the light of that is that sometimes when people disagree with us, we think they're in such profound opposition to us, it's almost as if that they're sitting on the opposition benches, if you like. But actually, I think sometimes it's more that, well, they simply understand a situation differently. They have a different desire, a different goal. They have a different motive. They're coming from a different perspective. We don't always think that those who disagree with us are opponents of us or opponents of our God. Anyway, that's Sanballat. Tobiah, we know a little bit less about him. He seems to be Sanballat's subordinate. He was an Ammonite, which probably meant he was previously a slave from Ammon. But he'd obviously done well and come up through the ranks, if you like. And both of these characters were very much disturbed, is my translation in verse 10, very much disturbed that Nehemiah had been appointed to restore Jerusalem. Why? Why did it even bother them? Well, it's all to do with regional politics and power. Because basically, a strong and safe Jerusalem would mean a slightly less strong, possibly even weakened Samaria. And as I said, Sanballat was governor of Samaria, and he wouldn't have wanted that. He would have wanted Samaria to be strong, and therefore he was quite happy for Jerusalem to be weak and to be insecure. There's almost a sense in which he might have thought to himself, oh, let's keep them down because it makes us feel safer and stronger. You see where they're coming from. Anyway, that takes us to the end of verse 10. So in this first section, what do we see? This request that Nehemiah makes of the king. Firstly, the petition to the king, followed then by the permission from the king. So let's then move from those first 10 verses, the request, and move then to verse 11. We won't get through to the end of verse 20, but it is one section. And after the request, we get the review. That's the main word to cling on to under this section, the review or the inspection, if you like. Nehemiah's capacity for detailed planning has already been seen in the way in which he perhaps skillfully, perhaps led by God's Spirit, asks for letters of support as he makes his journey to Jerusalem? Well, again, his ability to plan in advance is seen here, certainly in verses 11 to 16. I'd encourage you to read those now. Maybe pause the video if you need to do that. But make sure you've glanced at or at least read verses 11 to 16. In these verses, Nehemiah examines the situation. And yet, for all his drive and determination, he doesn't rush into action or into talking. In fact, verse 11 indicates that he'd already spent 3 days in Jerusalem before he undertakes this almost secret inspection at night. It says in verse 12, and this inspection or review of the situation would acquaint him with the reality of what he was facing with. It would also help him face the possible resistance that he might receive from those who, well, you've heard of those who typically say, it can't be done. You know, you've come across people like that, haven't you, when you put forward a suggestion or an idea or a proposal and they say, it can't be done. Well, finding exactly what the situation was would help Nehemiah deal with and respond to any who would object in that way. What does he do? He examines it. And in verse 13, it says he starts at the valley gate. This is his starting point, probably the south wall, the southwest corner of the city. And then he travels east about 500 yards to the dung gate. And that's where they used to take all the rubbish out of the city. And then he moves around to the King's Pool, it says. You see it in the text, which was possibly the Pool of Siloam, and then the Fountain Gate on the eastern wall. So he's traveling up the eastern side of the city. The valley in verse 15, probably the Kidron Valley, way down off the hillside. And then Nehemiah seems to retrace his steps. He doesn't seem to attempt to do a full circuit of the city. Perhaps that's because the eastern side, which would be the side on which there was the steepest slope, was possibly the most damaged, the worst, in the worst condition. And therefore, once he'd seen the worst, then he had an idea of the task before him. What is known from historical and archaeological records is that when Nehemiah did start the rebuilding, he'd made no attempt to follow the existing line of the wall in this area. In fact, it was in a bad place and it was too badly damaged. What he did was he built his wall upon the ridge of the southeastern hill above the actual area of acute destruction. A little bit further up, a little bit better. Now, I don't want to read too much into that, but let's at least admit that as we seek to build back better as Christians and as a local church and as churches generally, as we build back better, that does not necessarily mean that we will build the exact same thing in the exact same way in the exact same place. It might be that building back better means that it's different in a different place, looks a different shape, achieves a different purpose. Just something to think about. That's the end of our study this time. Next time, we're going to pick up from verse 17 onwards, where we have Nehemiah's exhortation and his enthusiasm as he encourages the people to get on with the building. In the meantime, I'll say au revoir for now, and would encourage you simply to go back and read those first 16 verses of Nehemiah chapter 2. Be blessed and encouraged by them. So look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care. God bless.